Hello. In the previous session we got to know what dependency injection is, learned that the objects of our classes have to be instantiated in the container, as well as we created XML description of the container where we defined our beans. Before we start the application we have to have a look in detail of how to name the bins and also how to inject the required dependencies. There are two ways of naming the bins in Spring. You can specify the name of the bin either in id or name attribute. What is the difference between them? Id is a formal XML attribute. That is, tags in XML documents, which were created according to XML scheme, can contain it. But it can be only one and it is unique. Old Spring versions, before 3.2, had a limitation regarding the symbols that id can contain. Only the letters of the English alphabet, digits and some other symbols were allowed. It is possible to use any symbols in the newer versions of Spring. On the one hand, it is good that it has to be unique. This is because of the fact that we need bins to have unique names for us to be able to address them correctly. Apart from it, XML parser will be able to execute additional checks, connected to id. On the whole, using id attribute for naming the bin will be appropriate in most cases. Still, we also have the name attribute. The special thing about it is that you can write a few names, separating them with spaces, commas or semicolon. In this case, you will be able to address one bin by different names. The first name will be the main one, the other names will be the aliases of the bean. It may come in handy to make the description of the context more clear for the programmer. For instance, if you have the class which implements two interfaces, that is, performs the roles of two entities. For example, client service and logon service. Still, you have one class only. In this case you can assign two names for the bin and address the appropriate name in different parts of the context. In the future you will probably divide the class into two separate classes. And all you will need is to identify two separate bins with different names while you won't have to make any changes in the description of the context. Interestingly, in the definition of the bin you can specify both the id and the name. Both of them will be working and will become the aliases. So, you can use this in different ways as you wish. Just remember about the constraints connected with id. And follow just one way that you've chosen. You can assign the alias of the bin using name attribute. As well, you can use a separate tag alias. There is no crucial difference. But a separate tag can be useful when you connect an external context to the existing one. And you cannot change it. That is, you cannot specify other names in the name tag for the bean. At the same time, you want to address it by a different name. Then, the alias tag will be most helpful. You just specify it in the description of the context and go ahead. The name of the bin is extremely important for the reason that we are going to request this bin from the context, specifying its name. Also, for injecting dependencies we are going to specify where each bin should go, again, using its name. Of course, Spring can execute dependency injection, using only the types of the objects. I will talk about it later. Yet, in large systems, where different types can implement the same interface, there can be difficulty with it. So, it is very likely that the names will be useful. Now, how do we inject the information into the bean? Spring can do this in two ways, either through the constructor or through getters, setters. We'll start with the constructor. If we want to inject some static data, then we just write constructor arg, assign the value, write equals and assign some value. Let us do this for our client class. Create the constructor there and inject two values, some client id and some name. Pay attention to the following thing. The arguments in the constructor may have the same types. For example, only strings. Does that mean that Spring is going to inject values in the same order? By default, Spring injects in the same order that you script them in XML. If you want to change the order, then you can use the index attribute. In this case, you will specify the ordinal number of the argument of the constructor. The indexes are fine provided there are not many arguments in the constructor. It happens there are around 20 of them there and you have specified an index for each of them in Spring. And then you want to squeeze in another argument in between. Then you'll have to change all the indexes that follow. Or you have to avoid writing constructors with so many arguments. If the types of the arguments are different, then their data can be assigned in a random order. Spring will understand where each parameter should go. It may happen though that you have specified a value, for example 1, for the integer parameter. And you've also specified 1 for the Spring type parameter. In this case, you can specify the argument type in the constructor. This will allow you not to depend on the indexes. You can also assign values by the argument's names. That is, you write the name as it is in the code and its value as well. But it will only work on condition that debug symbols are on while compiling the app. Then Spring will be able to recognize the names of the arguments and input the values through reflection. Surely, you will not do this with production code. Fine. We've just done another step on the way to improving our app. We've externalized static data into an external configuration file. So far, it's not a property file. But XML is also a text file, it can be committed and is considerably easier to change. So, how do we inject bins into each other? You have to use ref attribute in constructor arg. The value of this attribute will be the name of the bin that you want to inject. Perform these actions for class app bin. Move client and logger into its constructor. In this case, there's no need to write the type. The order of the arguments is not important, because Spring will identify by class where to input each bean. The important thing is that if Spring is not be able to find the constructor that receives the specified number of arguments, then there'll be an error. If you don't specify the arguments of the constructor in XML, then Spring will call the constructor by default, the one without parameters. And you will need to declare it if you have other constructors with parameters. It's also important to know that the access modifier of the constructor may be any, private, protected, public. Spring will create an object and call the constructor in any case. So, for now, we've created a complete description of Spring container in XML, specified 3 bins in it. And now with the start of the application, Spring will create these objects, will determine the id and name for the client, and will pass the client-s and logger-s objects to the app class. All we have to do is to create a container in our app and launch it. There are 2 types of containers in Spring Framework. The first one is bin factory. It's an elementary container. For the most part, it does one thing only, dependency injection. That is, it comes to action to create the bins and inject them where necessary. It cannot do anything else. The second one is application context. It does the same things as bin factory. Moreover, it provides framework services for controlling the beans. How do we create context in the program? We define the variable application context. By the way, it's interface. And we just use new, create the corresponding context, and specify for it, where it should search for spring.xml file. Then we call getBin method, to which we pass the name of the bean. In our case, it's app. Generally, application context contains different methods for receiving the bean. You can receive them by name, by class, by both the name and the class. You can even request the bins with specific annotation. If you request the bin by its name, you'll have to do the cast of the returning object yourself. If you request the bin by the class, or both by the name and the class, then, thanks to generics, you will not have to do the cast. When creating application context object, you can pass several XML files. Different bins can be described in each of them, they can even inject each other. In this case, Spring will unite the descriptions and create one context with all the bins altogether. Well, we've now finished creating a simple application with help of Spring Framework. Hello world, it's here. In the following sessions, we are going to learn different shticks and make the program more complex. Stay tuned, smile.